On a bright morning in Galveston, Texas, the air was thick with anticipation, curiosity, and a quiet tension that no one could quite name. It was June 19th, 1865, a date that would later echo through history as Juneteenth. On this, Major General Gordon Granger, a man representing the Union Army, arrived with a clear mission: to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation in one of the last Confederate strongholds where slavery had stubbornly endured. For the black community in Texas, many of whom had been living in bondage for generations, this was the day they had long been promised freedom but never experienced. Imagine living your entire life under the shadow of slavery, where every day is dictated by the whims of others. Your family could be torn apart at any moment, and the hope of liberation seems like a distant, almost impossible dream. For decades, Texas had remained largely untouched by Union forces, making it a stronghold where the cruel system of slavery persisted unabated. Despite President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years earlier, many enslaved people in Texas had no knowledge that freedom had been declared. They continued to toil in the fields, care for the homes of their owners, and endure the harsh punishments reserved for those who dared to dream of liberation. On that historic morning, General Granger rode into Galveston with authority, courage, and a message that would forever change the lives of thousands. Standing before a gathered crowd, he read aloud General Order No. 3, announcing that all enslaved people were free and that equality under the law would now apply to everyone. The words were simple but revolutionary. Freedom was no longer a promise or a distant hope, it was reality. Mothers held their children close. Fathers looked around with cautious optimism, and a community that had endured unimaginable hardships began to imagine a life where they could make choices for themselves, for the first time in their lives. But this was not just a single event, it was the culmination of decades of resistance, resilience, and the unwavering desire for justice. The story of Juneteenth is not simply about a proclamation or a single day. It is about the triumph of human spirit against oppression, about the countless individuals who survived the cruelty of slavery and refused to let it define their future. It is a story that reminds us all that freedom, once achieved, carries the weight of responsibility, remembrance, and celebration. As we journey through this story, you will meet extraordinary individuals whose lives exemplify courage and endurance. From children separated from their families to adults who labored under unimaginable conditions, their experiences paint a vivid picture of the true meaning of Juneteenth. Their stories demand to be told, remembered, and honored, not just as history, but as living lessons that inspire us today. If you are ready to uncover the untold stories behind Juneteenth, dive deep into the lives of those who fought for freedom in the face of adversity, and witness the power of resilience and hope, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can celebrate history, honor the journey to freedom, and ensure that these stories continue to inspire generations to come. As the sun rose over Galveston on that historic day of June 19th, 1860, a palpable sense of anticipation hung over the small town, blending with the usual sounds of morning life: the distant clatter of horses' hooves, the rustle of leaves in the warm Texas breeze, and the soft murmur of people beginning their daily routines. But today, the air carried a tension and expectation that was unlike any other. For word had spread that Major General Gordon Granger had arrived with the Union Army, bearing news that would forever alter the lives of countless black families who had lived under the crushing weight of slavery for generations. As Granger stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, his voice resonated across the town square, carrying a message that was at once both revolutionary and profoundly simple. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued more than 2 years earlier, was now to be enforced in Texas, and with it came a promise of freedom and the legal equality of all people, regardless of the chains that had once bound them. For those who had spent their entire lives in bondage, The words themselves were almost unimaginable. A startling declaration that challenged the very foundation of the society in which they had been forced to live. Families who had been torn apart by sales and auctions. Parents who had never known the comfort of holding their children without fear. And individuals who had labored from sunrise to sunset with no hope of claiming the fruits of their own work were suddenly confronted with the reality that their lives, their bodies, and their very identities were no longer property but belonged to themselves. The proclamation did not merely signal the end of forced labor. It redefined relationships, transforming the oppressive hierarchy that had long dictated every interaction into one governed by legal recognition of equality and mutual respect. Former masters could no longer claim ownership, and former slaves were no longer subject to the whims of another's power. The law now demanded a recalibration of every social and economic interaction that had been shaped by centuries of injustice. The profound significance of this transformation was felt in the smallest gestures and the quietest exchanges across Texas. Men who had worked fields from dawn until dusk paused to look upon their hands, contemplating that for the first time, the labor they performed was their own. Women who had borne the physical and emotional burdens of both household servitude and agricultural toil felt the weight of centuries of imposed limitations lift, if only slightly, as the promise of autonomy and self-determination settled in their minds. Children, who had grown up witnessing the endless cycle of oppression, now glimpsed a future where their choices could extend beyond the boundaries dictated by someone else's sense of entitlement. Imagining schools, communities, and lives that were theirs to shape. And yet, freedom was not simply a word, it was a tangible, living reality that required adaptation, courage, and a willingness to navigate a world that had been constructed to deny them agency at every turn. As Granger's proclamation spread through towns and plantations, it catalyzed a ripple of change that was both immediate and enduring. Enslaved individuals began to make decisions that had once been unimaginable, choosing where to go, whom to trust, and how to rebuild the fractured connections of family and community. Many ventured beyond the places that had constrained them, seeking out kin and loved ones who had been scattered by the brutality of the slave trade. Others took careful steps to secure livelihoods in a society that was unprepared for their presence as equals. Negotiating wages, forming cooperative communities, and asserting rights that had long been denied. The legal acknowledgement of equality was not just symbolic. It was a declaration that every person had the right to participate fully in the civic, social, and economic life of their region, and it created a foundation upon which new generations could build. Yet the road to realizing the full impact of the proclamation was fraught with challenges. Decades of systemic oppression had left deep scars, both physical and psychological, and the institutions that had thrived on enslaved labor were slow to adjust. Resisting the inevitable transformation that Granger's words demanded, disputes arose over land, contracts, and wages, as formerly enslaved people sought recognition of their rights and former owners attempted to preserve elements of the old order. The proclamation, while legally definitive, required persistent effort and vigilance to translate into tangible freedom and equality in everyday life. It became a catalyst for education, legal advocacy, and community organization, as Black Texans strove to claim the dignity, respect, and opportunities that had been long denied to them. Their determination reshaped neighborhoods, economies, and social structures, laying the groundwork for generations to come. Stories emerged across the state that captured the essence of this momentous shift. Families united after years of separation, and communities came together to celebrate their newfound autonomy, giving birth to traditions and rituals that honored resilience and survival. Individuals who had endured unimaginable hardships began documenting their experiences, ensuring that the truth of their lives, both the suffering and the triumph, would be preserved for posterity. In each account, The proclamation was more than a document. It was the spark that ignited hope, the affirmation that justice, though delayed, was achievable, and the reminder that freedom is both a legal and moral imperative that must be actively defended and exercised. The beauty and power of this moment lie in its duality. It is both a celebration and a challenge, a declaration of liberty and an invitation to forge a future built on equality, respect, and opportunity. Juneteenth is not merely a day to remember history. It is a living testament to the courage, persistence, and indomitable spirit of those who refuse to accept oppression as their fate. As we reflect on that day when Major General Gordon Granger's proclamation transformed Texas, we are reminded that freedom is not simply granted, it is realized through action, advocacy, and the unwavering belief in the dignity of every human being. It is a story that continues to resonate, inspiring all who hear it to honor the past by striving for a more just and equitable world today. If you are moved by the story of Juneteenth and want to continue exploring the profound histories and untold stories of resilience, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, so we can journey together through the remarkable tapestry of human courage and the enduring pursuit of freedom. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, the promise of freedom remained largely theoretical for many enslaved people in Texas, a state that had remained stubbornly isolated from the forces of the Union Army. For years, vast plantations and small homesteads alike continued to operate under the cruel and exploitative system of slavery, defying federal orders as if the proclamation had never existed. In the remote corners of Texas, where Union soldiers rarely ventured and the reach of federal authority was tenuous at best, black men, women, and children continued to labor from sunrise to sunset, cultivating cotton, tending livestock, and maintaining households, all while their families were separated, their movements restricted, and their lives treated as property to be bought, sold, and traded. The legal declaration of emancipation meant little in the face of economic interests and entrenched social norms that had long been invested in the maintenance of human bondage. Landowners, motivated by both greed and a deeply ingrained belief in the racial hierarchy, found ways to circumvent the proclamation, ensuring that the labor of enslaved people remained available to sustain their wealth and power. Sales of enslaved individuals continued openly, as men and women were auctioned like commodities, stripped of their identities and agency, and sent to distant plantations with no hope of reunion with their loved ones. Some transactions were formal, involving contracts and promissory notes that documented the transfer of enslaved labor as property, while others were informal arrangements that relied on local complicity and intimidation to enforce compliance. In every case, the underlying message was unmistakable. Federal law might declare freedom, but on the ground in Texas, the institution of slavery persisted through the determination of those who refused to let go of their human property. The resistance to emancipation was not merely passive, it was deliberate and organized, reflecting a conscious effort to undermine the moral and legal authority of the Union government. Slaveholders employed intimidation, violence, and coercion to maintain control, often threatening or punishing those who attempted to assert their newly granted rights. Families were torn apart through sales and forced relocations, ensuring that even those who had received news of the proclamation were left isolated and vulnerable. Reports from the time recount instances where individuals, despite knowing that legally they were free, were forced to continue performing grueling labor, often under the supervision of overseers who wielded whips, threats, and brutal physical punishments to enforce compliance. The lived reality of emancipation, for many, was delayed by months or even years, as freedom had to be claimed in the face of entrenched power and relentless exploitation. The economic stakes for Texas slaveholders were enormous, which only fueled their resistance. cotton fields, cattle ranches, and sugar plantations formed the backbone of the state's economy, and the sudden loss of enslaved labor threatened both wealth and social status. Many landowners attempted to exploit loopholes in contracts or exploit ignorance among newly freed individuals to maintain a system of coerced labor, often rebranding it under terms like hired help or indentured servitude to mask the continued deprivation of freedom. These arrangements created a liminal space in which slavery's formal abolition existed on paper, but had yet to take hold in everyday life, leaving Black Texans to navigate a world in which legal rights were tenuous and constantly challenged by those unwilling to accept change. Yet amidst this defiance, the spirit of resilience among the enslaved community persisted. Stories from the time reveal acts of quiet resistance. People who secretly taught each other to read and write despite prohibitions. Families who maintained connections through coded messages and clandestine gatherings. And individuals who made daring escapes to Union lines whenever the opportunity presented itself. These acts were not just defiance. They were affirmations of humanity, assertions of selfhood that refused to be extinguished by the daily realities of oppression. The Emancipation Proclamation, though ignored by many in Texas, provided a beacon of hope, a legal and moral anchor that would eventually be enforced with the arrival of Union forces under Major General Granger on that pivotal day in June 1865. The stories of Sterling Aaron, Sarah Ashley, Frank Bale, and countless others underscore the human cost of this resistance. Sterling Aaron, torn from his family and forced to labor on multiple plantations, did not immediately realize his freedom even after Lincoln's proclamation, because the social and economic structures around him continued to enforce bondage. Sarah Ashley endured brutal conditions as a child sold into the Deep South, and remained under harsh oversight until she was finally freed at 19. Frank Bale experienced a different but equally cruel form of delayed liberation, where psychological terror and coerced labor kept him captive even after the war's conclusion. Each narrative reflects the same fundamental truth: that freedom, while legally granted, required enforcement, advocacy, and personal courage to become a lived reality. The persistent defiance of emancipation by Texas slaveholders highlights the complex and uneven path toward freedom in the United States. It reminds us that legal decrees alone are insufficient to transform societies built on centuries of oppression, and that achieving justice requires both institutional enforcement and the courage of those who are denied their rights. Juneteenth, therefore, is not merely a celebration of a single day. It is a recognition of the long struggle to make freedom real, of the bravery of individuals who endured and resisted, and of the relentless pursuit of dignity against formidable odds. It represents the triumph of moral law over entrenched economic interests, the victory of human resilience over systemic cruelty, and the affirmation that even when liberty is delayed, it remains an imperative that will ultimately be realized. By understanding the determination of those who ignored the Emancipation Proclamation, and the courage of those who claimed it anyway, we gain a deeper appreciation for Juneteenth as a milestone in the ongoing story of freedom. If this story resonates with you, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, so we can continue sharing the untold stories of courage, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of justice. Even as the Emancipation Proclamation had been declared over 2 years earlier, the path to true freedom in Texas was far from straightforward, complicated not only by the defiance of slaveholders but also by the legal system itself, which often reinforced the status quo rather than challenging it. One of the most telling examples of this tension was the case of Williams versus Arnest, a dispute that erupted over a contract involving formerly enslaved people, revealing the intricate and stubborn entanglement of slavery with law, property, economic interests. In this particular instance, Williams G. Meo had agreed to pay Henrietta Arnest a substantial sum for hiring 3 enslaved individuals for a year. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation had already made clear that these individuals were legally free, Williams refused to honor the agreement, insisting that the workers were no longer property, while Arnes pursued the claim, arguing that the contract was binding and that she was owed payment. The case went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court, whose ruling in favor of Arnes underscored the reality that, in the eyes of the law at that moment, slavery had not truly ended and that former enslaved people were still enmeshed in systems of economic exploitation and contested ownership. This case is far more than a historical footnote. It illuminates the deeply entrenched nature of slavery in Texas and the extraordinary challenges faced by black people even after emancipation had been declared. The courts became arenas where the old order attempted to assert itself through legal reasoning, preserving the wealth and power of slave-holding families while delaying the implementation of freedom. Contracts, debts, land ownership, and labor agreements were all scrutinized and debated in ways that frequently ignored the human cost and prioritized property rights over the newly recognized rights of formerly enslaved individuals. These disputes made clear that emancipation was not merely a political or military event, but a profound social and legal upheaval. Demanding negotiation, advocacy, and, ultimately, the intervention of federal authority to enforce the promises of liberty. Beyond the courtroom, these legal battles had tangible effects on the lives of everyday people. Formerly enslaved men and women were suddenly navigating a society in which their freedom was acknowledged by law but continually challenged in practice. They faced uncertainty about employment, housing, and even family reunification, as contracts and property disputes threatened to undermine the basic conditions of their lives. In some cases, they were forced to continue working under the same plantation owners or former masters while legal battles played out. Caught in a liminal space between bondage and autonomy, the emotional and psychological toll of this in-between status cannot be overstated. As freedom, while promised, was contingent on enforcement and often delayed by the very institutions that were supposed to uphold justice. The story of Sterling Aran, for example, intersects with these broader legal and economic realities. Though he ultimately learned of his freedom through Major General Granger's proclamation on June 19, 1860, Aran had endured years of labor under the watchful eyes of multiple plantation owners, each acting within or stretching the boundaries of the law to maintain control over his labor. Contracts were made, promises were broken, and the courts frequently favored property claims over the human dignity of those who had been enslaved. The Williams versus Arnes case mirrors the lived experience of Sterling and countless others, showing how the slow, contested enforcement of emancipation left formerly enslaved individuals vulnerable to exploitation long after the war had ended. Similarly, Sarah Ashley's experiences illuminate the same dynamic from a different perspective. Though she endured years of being bought, sold, and transported as a child and adolescent, the legal and economic systems surrounding her allowed her former owners and speculators to profit from her labor, even as emancipation was proclaimed. Her freedom, like Sterling's, was not immediate. It required not only military intervention but also the navigation of a complex network of social, legal, and economic systems that had been designed to sustain slavery. The courts, local officials, and even neighbors could become obstacles rather than allies in the journey toward autonomy, making the legal affirmation of freedom only part of a much larger struggle. The persistence of slavery in legal terms until military enforcement underscores the broader truth that freedom is never simply granted. It must be claimed and defended, often in the face of entrenched opposition. The courts, far from being neutral arbiters, reflected the values and priorities of a society still deeply invested in the hierarchies of race and wealth. By challenging the proclamations of liberty and defending property claims, Cases like Williams versus Arnest reveal how deeply systemic injustice can be, extending beyond individual actions to permeate institutions that shape daily life. They remind us that legal recognition of rights, while essential, is insufficient without the means and will to implement and protect those rights in practice. This intersection of law, property, and human freedom also highlights the economic motivations underlying slavery. The individuals and families who challenged the abolition of slavery in court were not merely clinging to tradition. They were defending a system of wealth and labor on which entire communities and industries had been built. Formerly enslaved people were central to these economic structures, and legal disputes often treated them as commodities rather than human beings, revealing the stark dissonance between moral law and economic interest. Yet, amidst these challenges, the courage and resilience of Black Texans persisted as they navigated legal uncertainties, reclaimed their labor, and worked to assert their rights against powerful forces determined to deny them. In the end, the resolution of such cases required both federal intervention and the persistent effort of those who refused to accept second-class status. When Union troops arrived to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, they not only read the words of freedom aloud, but also acted to ensure that those words had tangible effect, breaking the legal and economic stranglehold that had persisted in Texas. Juneteenth, therefore, is not only a celebration of a declaration of freedom, but a recognition of the complex and contested journey required to transform legal pronouncements into lived reality. It is a reminder that justice often demands vigilance, advocacy, and the courage to confront deeply entrenched systems of power, and that the journey from bondage to equality is both a personal and collective triumph. By understanding the legal battles, the court cases, and the lived experiences behind them, we can appreciate Juneteenth not simply as a historical date, but as a testament to the persistence, resilience, and courage required to claim freedom, reminding us of the enduring power of law, justice, and human determination. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel as we continue to explore the untold stories of courage, justice, and resilience that shaped history. In Texas, the institution of slavery was not merely a social norm, but the very backbone of the state's economy, woven into every aspect of agricultural production, land management, and social hierarchy, so deeply entrenched that its abolition threatened not only the livelihood of slaveholders, but the structural foundation of their wealth and influence. The sprawling cotton plantations, cattle ranches, and sugar fields that dominated the landscape were maintained through the uncompensated labor of enslaved Black people, whose work generated immense profits and sustained a way of life that extended far beyond the plantation gates. For generations, white Texans had built fortunes on this labor, acquiring land, expanding operations, and consolidating social power in ways that were inseparable from the system of bondage. Consequently, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, it did not immediately open these economic structures. Rather, it introduced a legal challenge that many were determined to resist through every means available to them. Former slave owners, acutely aware that freedom would directly impact their financial standing, employed various strategies to delay or circumvent the enforcement of emancipation. Some continued to buy, sell, and trade enslaved individuals under the guise of business transactions, leveraging local courts, contracts, and promissory notes to preserve the appearance of legal legitimacy. Others manipulated labor arrangements, reclassifying formerly enslaved people as hired help or indentured servants, requiring work for wages that were often minimal or withheld entirely, thereby maintaining economic exploitation in all but name. Even families who had been promised freedom through contracts or wills were frequently betrayed, their human rights subordinated to the financial interests of those entrusted to honor such agreements. This deliberate defiance illustrates the depth of commitment to preserving wealth at all costs, highlighting that for many, the concept of freedom posed not only a social and moral challenge, but a direct threat to personal fortune and status. The economic stakes were particularly evident in the contested lands and labor contracts that became the subject of numerous legal disputes across Texas, such as the Williams versus Arnes case, where formerly enslaved individuals remained entangled in lawsuits over wages and property, even after Lincoln's proclamation had declared them free. Courts often sided with white property owners, interpreting legal principles in ways that protected wealth rather than upholding the liberty of formerly enslaved people. These decisions reinforced a system in which economic imperatives overrode moral and legal considerations, creating a liminal space where slavery's formal abolition existed only on paper while its practical application was delayed. The persistence of such arrangements underscores that freedom was never simply granted by a federal decree. It had to be claimed, enforced, and defended in the face of systemic resistance. For the individuals caught in this web of economic and legal entanglement, the daily reality of bondage continued long after the official end of the Civil War. People like Sterling Aaron experienced the betrayal of promises, the interruption of family bonds, and the exploitation of their labor, even as they became aware that they were legally free. Similarly, Sarah Ashley's life, marked by her sail across state lines and forced labor on multiple plantations, demonstrates how economic motivations perpetuated human suffering, as owners and speculators profited from the continued labor of those they were legally obligated to release. Frank Bale, too, endured ongoing subjugation even after military intervention, forced to navigate a world in which the economic logic of slavery persisted through intimidation, coercion, and exploitation. Each story reveals the immense human cost of a system that placed wealth above humanity, showing that the path from slavery to freedom was neither immediate nor guaranteed. The strategies employed by former slaveholders were not merely incidental but reflected a calculated effort to protect generational wealth and social hierarchy. Enslaved labor was integral to the production of cash crops like cotton, which fueled both local economies and broader trade networks. The sudden loss of this labor threatened to collapse plantation operations, erode profits, and destabilize social standing. Recognizing this, many landowners sought to extract maximum value from formerly enslaved individuals before freedom could be fully realized. Using debt, coercion, and legal manipulation to extend labor obligations under new guises. This exploitation often continued until the arrival of Union forces under Major General Granger, whose enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in June 1865 represented not only a legal victory but a direct intervention to break the economic hold that slavery still exerted over Texas society. The economic dimension of resistance to emancipation also highlights a broader truth about the institution of slavery. It was not merely a matter of moral or social injustice, but an intricate system of financial dependence and power that shaped the lives of millions. Families were torn apart, personal agency was denied, and human potential was stifled to maintain economic advantage. The very laws and courts that were supposed to uphold justice were often co-opted to protect property and financial interests, reinforcing the entrenchment of systemic oppression. In this sense, the struggle for freedom in Texas was as much about reclaiming economic agency and human dignity as it was about achieving legal recognition of emancipation. Juneteenth, therefore, emerges as a celebration not only of the reading of a proclamation but of the dismantling of an entrenched economic order that had sought to deny freedom in the service of wealth accumulation. It commemorates the courage of those who endured extended bondage, the determination of military forces to enforce justice, and the resilience of a community that navigated legal and economic obstacles to assert their humanity. The events surrounding the emancipation of Black Texans serve as a vivid reminder that freedom is inseparable from the structures that support or inhibit, and that the pursuit of justice requires both moral conviction and active enforcement. By understanding the economic imperatives that drove resistance to emancipation, we gain a fuller appreciation for the significance of Juneteenth as a milestone in American history. It is a day that honors the triumph of human dignity over entrenched financial interests, the persistence of legal and moral principles in the face of systemic opposition, and the extraordinary resilience of those who claimed their freedom against formidable odds. If you found this exploration of history compelling, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we continue sharing the untold stories that illuminate the struggle for justice, liberty, and human dignity. Sterling Arona's story is a vivid testament to the human cost of slavery and the prolonged struggle for freedom in Texas. A tale that intertwines personal suffering with the broader legal, economic, and social dynamics of the post-Civil War South, showing how emancipation, though decreed, was delayed for countless individuals until the intervention of Union forces on June 19, 1860. Born around 1853 into bondage near Jacksonville, Texas, Sterling entered a world in which his identity, family bonds, and daily labor were dictated entirely by the whims of those who claimed ownership over him. A life in which childhood and innocence were eclipsed by labor, fear, and separation from loved ones. His mother, Anne, along with other female relatives including his grandmother and aunts, were owned by Albertus Arwine, a man whose financial interests superseded any moral consideration, and while he retained female slaves to oversee household and field work, he routinely sold male enslaved people as they grew older, fracturing families and enforcing a hierarchy that valued property over human connection. Sterling never knew his father and was raised alongside his siblings, Joe, Will, John, Polly, and Rosie, all of whom shared the shadow of bondage. Yet the family would ultimately be splintered by the decisions of those who held them as property. When Albertus Arwine died, he left 900 acres of land to one of the enslaved women he owned, instructing a man named J. Paul to ensure the land reached her and to escort the family north to freedom. Yet even this small hope of autonomy was thwarted by betrayal, as J. Powell instead relocated Sterling and other members of the household to his own plantation, continuing to treat them as slaves, thus perpetuating the cycle of exploitation and instability. Sterling's youth was spent under the oppressive labor of J. And when he was stolen by men with dogs and transferred to John Mosius' plantation, he became entirely isolated from his family, forced to serve as a house slave, performing arduous and demeaning tasks such as cooking, fanning John Mosey while he slept, and accompanying the Mosey children to school, forbidden by law from gaining any formal education himself. Even as Sterling performed these duties, he bore witness to the horrors endured by others around him, seeing fellow black people auctioned naked on platforms, evaluated and sold based on physical strength, mothers torn from children, and families destroyed for profit. These experiences left indelible scars on his psyche, underscoring the brutal realities of an institution that had not yet been dismantled despite proclamations from Washington. C. The passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, while legally significant, did not immediately alter Sterling's life. Like many others in Texas, remained in bondage, illustrating the disconnect between legislative action and lived reality. It was not until General Gordon Granger's arrival in Galveston on June 19, 1860, that Sterling and countless others were finally informed of their freedom through General Order No. 3, a proclamation that only declared all enslaved people in Texas free but also mandated equality between former masters and the formerly enslaved, reshaping labor relationships and asserting the legal principle that former property owners could no longer claim dominion over human lives. Sterling's release was met with a mixture of emotions among those around him. John Mosey, his enslaver, showed no visible reaction, yet his wife Emma expressed anguish at the loss of property, revealing the extent to which wealth and human bondage were entwined in the consciousness of slaveholding families. For Sterling, this moment marked both liberation and the beginning of a new set of challenges, as the transition from enslavement to freedom required negotiating a world that had long denied him autonomy, education, and security. Sterling's narrative is enriched by the broader historical context, including the legal and economic battles that delayed emancipation for so many. Texas courts frequently adjudicated cases that treated formerly enslaved people as economic assets rather than human beings, with rulings such as Williams versus Arnest exemplifying the legal system's role in maintaining exploitation even after the proclamation of freedom. Property rights, labor contracts, and financial interests were rigorously defended by courts sympathetic to slaveholders, meaning that Sterling and others often found themselves in a liminal space free in theory, yet constrained by the economic and legal structures designed to perpetuate their labor. This intersection of law, economics, and human experience underscores the resilience required to claim freedom, as individuals like Sterling navigated both the physical realities of forced labor and the bureaucratic mechanisms of systemic oppression. Sterling's personal experiences reflect a wider truth about the delayed implementation of emancipation. Freedom is not only a legal status but a lived reality that requires enforcement, recognition, and social adaptation. The trauma of family separation, the relentless physical and emotional labor, and the constant negotiation with those seeking to maintain control left enduring psychological and social scars. Even after liberation, formerly enslaved individuals like Sterling had to assert their agency in a society structured to exploit them, reclaiming their identity, reconstructing family connections, and learning to navigate an economy and legal system that had long functioned to deny them dignity. His life illustrates the profound human impact of delayed emancipation, showing that while proclamations and orders can declare freedom, the lived experience of liberation demands vigilance, resilience, and courage. By situating Sterling Aron's story within the broader narrative of Juneteenth, one can see that the celebration of June 19, 1860, extends far beyond the reading of a federal order. It commemorates the endurance of individuals who survived decades of systemic oppression and the triumph of human will over entrenched systems of economic and social control. The arrival of Union forces and the enforcement of General Order No. 3 signaled the beginning of a tangible, enforceable freedom. But the legacy of slavery and the long road to autonomy continued to shape the lives of Sterling and his contemporaries. His narrative serves as a powerful reminder that freedom, while legally recognized, is never immediate or uncomplicated, and that the journey from bondage to self-determination is marked by struggle, courage, and resilience. If you are inspired by this story of endurance and triumph, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to bring you the untold stories of history. Human resilience and the enduring fight for justice. Sarah Ashley's life offers a haunting window into the relentless cruelty of slavery and the resilience required to survive its unyielding grip. A story that underscores the human cost of delayed emancipation and the brutal realities faced by enslaved children in the Deep South, illustrating the psychological and physical hardships that persisted until the arrival of Union forces on Juneteenth, 1860. Born around 1846 in Mississippi, Sarah's early years were defined by loss and exploitation, as her family was torn apart through the machinations of a white man named Henry Thomas, a slave speculator whose livelihood depended on buying and selling human lives with ruthless efficiency, demonstrating the cruel economics that underpinned the domestic slave trade. Her two sisters and father were sold off to Georgia, and Sarah herself was transported across state lines in a coffle along, chained march of enslaved people forced to travel vast distances for the profit of traders like Thomas, separated from everything familiar, thrust into a life dictated entirely by the demands and whims of those who considered her property. As a child, Sarah endured the daily horrors of plantation labor, forced to perform grueling tasks from before sunrise until after sunset, picking hundreds of pounds of cotton each day, transporting it long distances to storage facilities, and obeying the unrelenting orders of overseers who punished anyone who failed to meet their quotas with brutal beatings that could tear flesh and leave lasting scars. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate, and shelter minimal, with enslaved families crowded into small shacks while their owners resided in spacious homes. A constant, cruel reminder of the stark inequality and exploitation that defined every moment of their lives. Meetings, prayers, and social gatherings were forbidden, with punishments meted out for even the simplest acts of community or autonomy, reinforcing a system that sought to control not only the body but the mind, leaving children like Sarah acutely aware of their powerlessness and vulnerability in a world constructed to deny them agency and dignity. The terror Sarah experienced was compounded by the pervasive culture of violence that permeated plantations and towns alike, where punishments were public, severe, and designed to instill fear. She recounted incidents of enslaved individuals being whipped until their skin split, salt and pepper rubbed into their wounds as further torment, and others fleeing in desperation only to be caught and subjected to even harsher treatment, illustrating the psychological terror that accompanied the physical suffering. Each day of forced labor, each moment of threat and humiliation, underscored the reality that emancipation existed only as a distant concept, not a lived reality, and that the legal decree of freedom in 1863 had little immediate effect on the daily lives of people like Sarah, who remained under the control of merciless owners. Sarah's journey through multiple plantations, including the holdings of Moses Davis in Texas, exemplifies how economic interests and the desire to maintain labor supply perpetuated her exploitation until she reached the age of 19. A pivotal moment that coincided with the broader enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation by Union forces. When Davis died while away on business, Sarah and other enslaved individuals were informed by the new overseer that they were free, a revelation that marked both relief and uncertainty, as the newly liberated had to navigate a world where the structures of oppression remained, even if the legal chains were broken. The transition from childhood enslavement to free adulthood was fraught with challenges, as skills, education, and social networks had been systematically denied, leaving Sarah to find ways to support herself while confronting the enduring psychological trauma of years of forced labor. Familial separation and dehumanization. The story of Sarah Ashley, when linked to the broader narrative of Juneteenth, illuminates the complex interplay between legal freedom, economic exploitation, and personal endurance, demonstrating that emancipation was not a single event but a process of recognition, enforcement, and adaptation. Her life highlights the resilience required to survive physical exhaustion, emotional abuse, and the constant threat of violence, offering a poignant example of how children, often the most vulnerable, bore the brunt of a system that commodified human beings for profit. The psychological imprint of these experiences, fear, grief, and the struggle to assert autonomy in the face of relentless control, continued to shape formerly enslaved individuals long after they gained legal recognition as free people, underscoring that freedom, while necessary, was only the beginning of a long journey toward self-determination and dignity. By examining Sarah's experiences, one gains a richer understanding of the broader historical context in which Juneteenth emerged, revealing that the holiday commemorates not merely the reading of a proclamation, but the liberation of individuals who endured unimaginable hardship, often until the very last moments before Union enforcement. Her story exemplifies the human impact of delayed emancipation, illustrating the intersection of childhood suffering, economic exploitation, and the delayed realization of personal freedom, providing a deeply personal lens through which to comprehend the systemic cruelty of slavery. It also reinforces the broader lesson that historical milestones are meaningful only when connected to the lived experiences of those they affect, reminding us that Juneteenth celebrates resilience, survival, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom against overwhelming odds. If Sarah's story moves you, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing the untold stories of human endurance and the fight for justice that shape our collective history. Frank Bale's life is a stark and harrowing example of the enduring struggle for freedom faced by formerly enslaved individuals in the aftermath of the Civil War, revealing how legal emancipation did not automatically translate into personal liberty and how violence, coercion, and systemic oppression continued to shape the lives of Black people in New Orleans and beyond, underscoring the profound human cost of delayed and incomplete liberation. Born around 1850 in New Orleans, Frank entered a world in which his very existence was defined by the authority of Johnson Bale, a violent and unpredictable man who ran a saloon and cultivated an environment of fear, ensuring that Frank's every action, movement, and thought remained under constant scrutiny. From an early age, Frank was deprived of knowledge of his family, his parents, and his own identity, with Bale indoctrinating him with the belief that his mother was morally deficient and that he owed his allegiance entirely to his owner. A psychological manipulation designed to strip him of any sense of autonomy or personal worth and to reinforce the pervasive culture of domination that structured the lives of enslaved children. Frank's labor was extensive and demeaning, requiring him to manage the saloon's daily operations, attend to guests, and maintain order in a setting often characterized by violence, alcohol-fueled chaos, and the threat of harm, placing him in situations that no child should have to endure. The violent environment extended beyond routine labor. During one incident, a saloon dispute escalated into gunfire, resulting in fatalities. And Frank, despite his youth and fear, was forced by Bale to remove the bodies and dispose of them in a river. A traumatic event that exemplified the constant exposure to death, brutality, and moral compromise that defined his formative years. This pattern of coercion and fear persisted, with Bale routinely chaining Frank, beating him, and asserting dominance in ways that were meant to instill obedience, illustrating the continuity of slavery's control even after the formal end of the Confederacy and the legal abolition of slavery. A grim reality that demonstrates how the transition to freedom was neither immediate nor uniformly enforced. Even as the Civil War concluded and Union forces captured New Orleans, Bale resisted the societal and legal changes that threatened his control over Frank, refusing to recognize him as a free man and continuing to exploit his labor under the same oppressive conditions, highlighting the tenacity with which former enslavers sought to maintain authority and economic advantage. Frank's experiences reveal that emancipation was not a singular, universally experienced event but rather a contested, uneven process in which the newly freed had to assert their rights, navigate a society structured by entrenched racial hierarchies, and confront individuals determined to perpetuate bondage through legal loopholes. Intimidation and violence. The psychological impact of this prolonged subjugation was profound, as Frank lived under the constant fear of retribution, witnessing the ongoing mistreatment of others while struggling to claim autonomy over his own life, and to reconcile the promise of freedom with the reality of continued oppression. Beyond the immediate physical and psychological hardships, Frank's life also illuminates the broader structural mechanisms designed to suppress Black autonomy in post-war Louisiana, including laws and practices that criminalized unemployment among Black men, subjected them to arrest, and then leased their labor to private enterprises in a system known as convict leasing. This arrangement effectively extended the reach of slavery into the legal framework, ensuring that individuals like Frank, despite formal emancipation, remained bound to a cycle of labor exploitation, coerced service, and social marginalization, demonstrating that the struggle for freedom was not only about escaping physical bondage, but also about resisting systemic, institutionalized forms of control. Through these experiences, Frank's story exemplifies the intersection of personal trauma, structural oppression, and the ongoing fight for dignity and autonomy, emphasizing that emancipation was only a first step in a long journey toward true liberty. Frank's later life offers a glimpse into resilience and survival in the face of such extreme adversity, despite enduring years of psychological torment, forced labor, and social marginalization. He eventually forged a path toward self-determination, raising a family with Ida Feline Graham, working in sawmills and farms, and navigating the challenges of freedom in a society still riddled with racial inequities. His narrative underscores the courage required to reclaim agency, rebuild life, and create spaces of safety and dignity even after enduring profound trauma, reflecting a broader pattern among formerly enslaved individuals who had to negotiate a world that often resisted their newfound rights. The enduring lessons of Frank Bale's story resonate deeply within the context of Juneteenth, connecting the legal declaration of freedom with the human realities of oppression, highlighting the resilience required to survive and thrive despite systemic barriers, and illustrating that the path to liberation extended far beyond the reading of General Order No. 3 on June 19, 1860. By integrating Frank's experiences with the stories of Sterling Aran, Sarah Ashley, and other formerly enslaved individuals, one can better appreciate the multi-layered narrative of Juneteenth, a commemoration not only of legal emancipation but of survival, endurance, and the pursuit of autonomy against relentless forces of coercion, economic exploitation, and social marginalization. His story, filled with terror, endurance, and ultimate resilience, serves as a reminder that freedom is not simply granted through proclamations, but must be claimed, defended, and lived through the courage and perseverance of those who endured unimaginable hardships. Frank Bale's life illustrates that even in the aftermath of the Civil War, the fight for dignity, justice, and self-determination continued, offering a powerful lens through which to understand the human significance of Juneteenth and the ongoing struggle for true equality. If Frank's story moves you, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue to uncover and share the untold stories of courage, survival, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. Laura Hill's story brings into sharp focus the enduring legacy of oppression in the United States, demonstrating that the shadow of slavery extended well into the 20th century, and that for many black individuals, the promises of emancipation remained only partially fulfilled, subject to the persistence of exploitative labor practices, social marginalization, and systemic injustice, illustrating the ways in which the structures of control adapted even as legal slavery ended. Born in Good, Alabama, in 1893 to Robert and Elizabeth Hill, Laura's early life seemed ordinary in its familial structure, but quickly became defined by forced labor when the McKenna family relocated from Alabama to Texas and took her with them, effectively placing her under a quasi-slavery arrangement in their household, where she was expected to maintain the house, cook, clean, and tend to the family's animals, living in conditions that were harsh, controlled, and reminiscent of the antebellum South, despite the nation's official abolition of slavery decades earlier. From the age of 6, Laura's days were dominated by labor and obedience, her autonomy severely restricted, and her physical and emotional well-being subjected to the whims of her employers. A stark reminder that legal freedom did not always translate into personal liberty, especially for children whose work and lives could be coerced under the guise of domestic service. As Laura matured, The intensity of her labor remained unrelenting, and the McKenna family's control over her life continued unabated. Physical discipline and intimidation were common, reinforcing a hierarchy that positioned Laura not as a person with agency, but as property whose labor was owed in perpetuity. A pattern tragically familiar to many African Americans long after the formal end of slavery. Her requests for greater personal freedom were met with resistance and punishment, demonstrating how social and economic structures were used to perpetuate subjugation. While her identity as a black woman in early 20th century Texas constrained her options for escape, education, and self-determination. Despite these limitations, Laura found small ways to assert her agency, including her eventual access to a Black Baptist church at the age of 21, which became a critical site of community, spiritual support, and social interaction, allowing her a glimpse of life outside the confines of forced domestic labor and enabling her to form relationships that would help her plan her eventual escape from this near-slavery condition. The pivotal moment in Laura's life came with the careful planning and courage required to seize a degree of independence. She obtained money under the pretext of church dues, combined it with additional funds, and took the bold step of leaving the McKenna household. A decision that reflected not only her desire for freedom but also the enduring human spirit that sought self-determination in the face of systemic constraints and personal danger. Once she escaped, Laura relied on the assistance of compassionate individuals willing to provide shelter and support, highlighting the importance of community networks and solidarity in the pursuit of freedom for those who remained trapped in exploitative labor arrangements well after the formal end of slavery. Even after leaving, her survival depended on negotiating a world that remained structured by racial and gendered hierarchies, requiring her to hire herself out for domestic work to white families in order to earn a living. A stark reminder that economic independence was hard-won and that systemic inequalities continued to shape daily life for formerly subjugated individuals. Laura Hill's story, when situated within the broader historical context of Juneteenth and the experiences of individuals like Sterling Aaron, Sarah Ashley, and Frank Bell, reveals that the fight for freedom and autonomy did not end with legal cremations but extended across generations, demonstrating that emancipation was a process, not a singular event, and that systemic exploitation and quasi-slavery practices persisted long after the Civil War. Her narrative underscores the continuity of coercion, labor exploitation, and social control into the 20th century, providing a vivid illustration of how deeply ingrained structures of inequality adapted over time to maintain power over black labor and lives, thereby emphasizing the resilience required to navigate and survive such circumstances. By understanding Laura's experience, one gains a more nuanced comprehension of the long-term challenges faced by African Americans, the adaptability of oppressive systems, and the extraordinary courage required to claim even modest degrees of freedom in a society that frequently sought to deny it. Through Laura Hill's journey, viewers can appreciate the profound human impact of systemic injustice and recognize that freedom, though legally established, required vigilance, courage, and resourcefulness to truly achieve. Her story enriches the broader narrative of Juneteenth, linking the historical moment of 1865 with lived experiences that continued well into the 20th century, showing that the legacy of slavery was not confined to the past, but had enduring repercussions that shaped individual lives and collective memory. Laura's escape and subsequent life illuminate the resilience and determination necessary to reclaim personal agency, highlighting the ongoing struggle for dignity and equality, and reinforcing the significance of Juneteenth as a commemoration not only of emancipation, but of the enduring human pursuit of freedom, justice, and self-realization. If Laura's story resonates with you, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can continue uncovering the untold stories of endurance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of liberation that define Black history. As we reach the conclusion of this journey through the stories that define Juneteenth, it becomes clear that the holiday is far more than a single date on the calendar or a ceremonial reading of a proclamation. It is a testament to the resilience, courage, and unwavering spirit of Black Americans who endured unimaginable hardships and yet continued to strive for freedom and dignity in a world structured to deny them both. From the moment Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, on June 19, 1860, to deliver General Order No. 3, declaring enslaved people free, the story of emancipation in Texas reveals itself as a layered and complex narrative, where legal decrees intersected with human endurance, economic interests, and social resistance. It was not enough for a law to be written. The lived reality of freedom had to be claimed, fought for, and safeguarded. And it is in the stories of individuals like Sterling Aaron, Sarah Ashley, Frank Bale, and Laura Hill that we see the profound human dimension of this struggle. Each of these lives illuminates different aspects of the post-slavery experience: the separation from family, the brutal conditions of labor, the psychological torment of bondage, the defiance against continued oppression, and the small victories that gradually shaped a pathway toward autonomy. Sterling Aaron's experience of being born into slavery, torn from his family, and shuffled between plantations illustrates the deeply personal and often invisible toll of delayed emancipation. His freedom on Juneteenth was not simply the result of a proclamation. It was the culmination of countless moments of endurance, unseen and unrecorded in broader historical accounts, yet integral to understanding the full scope of what it meant to be freed. Similarly, Sarah Ashley's journey, marked by the cruelty of slave speculators and the daily terrors of plantation life, demonstrates the physical and psychological hardships endured by enslaved children and young adults. Her eventual freedom at 19 shows the delayed nature of justice and the profound courage required to survive an environment that systematically sought to dehumanize her. Frank Bale's life extends this narrative into the post-Civil War era, highlighting how legal emancipation could be rendered ineffective by individuals determined to exploit labor and maintain control, reminding us that freedom is never simply a legal concept, but a lived reality that must be claimed and defended. Laura Hill's story further extends the narrative into the 20th century, revealing that slavery-like conditions persisted long after formal abolition, demonstrating the tenacity of exploitative systems and the enduring need for vigilance, resilience, and community support in the pursuit of autonomy. Through her escape and subsequent navigation of a society structured by racial hierarchies, we see that freedom was not merely a gift but a continuous struggle, requiring strategy, courage, and the support of those willing to challenge inequity. Taken together, these narratives illustrate that Juneteenth is a holiday that honors survival, defiance, and the tireless pursuit of human dignity, emphasizing that the struggle for equality did not end with the surrender of Confederate troops, but continues in many forms to this day. The significance of Juneteenth lies not only in remembering the past, but in understanding the ongoing fight for justice, the ways in which systemic oppression adapts over time, and the necessity of acknowledging the humanity and experiences of those whose labor, lives, and suffering built the nation. By commemorating Juneteenth, we honor both the victories of those who survived and the lessons their lives impart. That freedom requires action, vigilance, and an unwavering commitment to justice. That history is made by individuals who refuse to accept subjugation, and that each story, whether widely recorded or preserved in personal memory, contributes to a fuller, more honest understanding of our collective past. In reflecting on these lives, we also recognize the intergenerational impact of slavery and its legacy, the importance of remembrance, and the moral responsibility to confront inequality wherever it persists. As we close this story, let us carry forward the lessons of resilience and defiance exemplified by those who endured bondage and fought for their freedom, remembering that Juneteenth is not only a celebration of emancipation, but a reminder that the pursuit of equality, justice, and dignity is ongoing, requiring commitment from each generation. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history, for listening to the voices of those whose lives shaped a struggle that continues to resonate, and for taking the time to reflect on the human cost and triumph of freedom. If this story has moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that we can continue sharing the untold stories of courage, resilience, and perseverance that form the backbone of Black history. May you carry the spirit of Juneteenth forward in your own life, honor the legacies of those who fought for freedom, and approach each day with a commitment to justice and empathy.